following video is about Alan Watts, William Lane Craig, the argument of something from nothing, or nothing from nothing, or something from something. Is the universe eternal? Did the universe just pop out of non-existence? If we can even say that. And finally, does the universe in fact have a cause, a first cause, and that cause being a transcendental cause? Or a transcendent cause, excuse me. So anyway, what I want to do here is I feel that there's been one person, to my mind, to my intuitions, that has really given the clearest sort of spiritual knowledge on the matter that really closes the philosophical gaps, where it used to seem that these were open-ended questions. And I think that there is this domain of knowledge that I think Stephen Priest, which I will put in this video, you'll notice him towards the end of the video, really does justice in trying to describe this other category of epistemology, if we have to put it that way, that really accounts for closing up these gaps in philosophy, and this being one of the most central issues about, I mean, it's this question that allows for a God to exist in the usual way that it's argued, rationally. You know, the cosmological argument stems from the first premise that the universe has a cause. And if the universe has a cause, that implies the intuition that out of nothing, nothing comes. Out of something, something comes. But not just out of any something, something special. So, as you can see, obviously I'm not a theist. But anyway, enjoy the video. That's all I got to say about this for now.
All stars. We're aboard the ferryboat Vallejo, which is tied up at the north end of Sausalito, close to San Francisco. And this is where I live. And you may think this place is rather weird. But that's because I've always loved weird things. I remember when I was a little boy, people used to say to me, "Alan, you're so weird. Why can't you be like other people?" Well, I thought that was just plain dull, like having the same thing for dinner every day. And as is well said, variety is the spice of life. And when I think over the weirdest of all things I can think of, you know what it is? Nothing. Targung, the great emptiness. The whole idea of nothing is something that has bugged people for centuries, especially in the West. Because we have a saying in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means that out of nothing comes nothing. You can't, in other words, get something out of nothing. And it's occurred to me that this is a fallacy of tremendous proportions that lies at the root of all our common sense, not only in the West, but in many parts of the East as well. And it comes up as a kind of terror of nothing, a put down on nothing, on everything to do with nothing, everything associated with nothing, such as sleep, passivity, rest. What has struck me is that nothing, the negative, the empty, is exceedingly powerful. Nothing is more fertile than emptiness. I would say not ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing comes nothing, but I would say you can't have something without nothing. So how do we basically begin to think about the difference between something and nothing? I can say, there is a cigar in my right hand and there is no cigar in my left hand. And so we get the idea of is here and isn't or empty here. But behind that, of course, lies the far more obvious contrast of solid and space. Now, we tend to think of space as nothing. When we talk about the conquest of space, there's a little element, notice, of hostility in that phrase. But actually, we're talking about the conquest of distance. Space as such, that is to say, whatever it is that lies between the Earth and the Moon and the Earth and the Sun, is considered to be just nothing at all. But to suggest how very powerful and important this nothing at all is, let me point out to you that if you didn't have space, you couldn't have anything solid. To begin with, without space outside the solid, you wouldn't know where the solid's edges were. For example, you can see me on the camera because you see a background here and all around me, and that background shows up my outline. It's, for example, difficult to see a hand unless there is a contrasting background. Were there no background to the hand itself would vanish. Nothing is more fertile than emptiness. But you always have to have a background to see a figure. You just can't do without it.
Western philosophy has been grounded on the idea ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing is nothing is nothing is nothing forever.
Some intrepid atheists have asserted that the universe just popped into being without a cause. But surely that's metaphysically impossible. For such a conclusion is, in the words of philosopher of science Baron of Königseider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being.
Chinese philosophy in the I Ching, in the Book of Changes, is founded on the principle that nothing implies something. That yin, the negative, implies yang, the positive. And since this is missing in our intellects, we are afraid of nothingness. And don't see that nothingness is the womb, is the empty space which generates something. In Mahayana it's called Tathagata Garbha, the womb of the Buddha. Nothing. The empty space. Lao Tzu says that the usefulness of a window is not so much in the frame as in the empty space through which light can be admitted. So Chinese thought has always recognized the powerfulness of the empty. And I will show you this in Chinese paintings, how space is used in a way that we don't use space.
Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, which call into question that assumption.
The ground. Tillich called God the ground of being, and he was reaching out in Jakob Böhmer's philosophy, where he calls God Ungrund, the ground of underneath everything, the background, the underground. Note the theological implications of that.
We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1. The universe began to exist. 2. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3. Therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause.
The ground of being is the emptiness, you see, in which everything can happen. And we think it's nothing. So form, you can see the form of my hand, see? You cannot possibly realize that form except in terms of space. Here, these V's. You say, all right, these are projections. These are outgoings. These are things. But you cannot realize unless you have the V's, the void, the ingoings between you. V for void.
Now, however, I think we should begin
by talking a little bit about when we use the word physical reality as distinct from abstraction, what are we talking about? Because you see, there's going to be a fight about this, philosophically. If I say that the final reality that we're living in is the physical world, a lot of people will say that I'm a materialist, that I'm unspiritual, and that I think too much of an identification of the man with the body. Any book that you open on yoga or Hindu philosophy will have in it a declaration that you start a meditation practice by saying to yourself, I am not the body. I am not my feelings. I am not my thoughts. I am the witness who watches all this and is not really any of it. And so if I were to say then that the physical world is the basic reality, I would seem to be contradicting what is said in these Hindu texts. But it all depends on what you mean by the physical world. What is it? First of all, it must be pointed out that the idea of the material world is itself philosophical. It is in its own way a symbol. And so if I take up something that is generally agreed to be something in the material world, and I argue that this is material, of course it isn't. Because nobody has ever been able to put their finger on anything material. That is to say, if by the word material you mean some sort of basic stuff out of which the world is made. By, say, analogy with the art of ceramics, pottery, we use clay and we form it into various shapes. And so a lot of people think that the physical world is various forms of matter. And nobody has ever been able to discover any matter. They've been able to discover various forms, yes, various patterns, but no matter. You can't even think how you would describe matter in some terms other than form. Because whenever a physicist talks about the nature of the world, he describes a form, he describes a process which can be put into the shape of a mathematical equation.
It turns out that Alice in Wonderland was the first rendition of a wormhole in the English language. The looking glass of Alice is the wormhole. You stick your hand through the glass and it winds up on the other side of forever. The most realistic representation of that would be a black hole. On paper anyway, a spinning black hole does not collapse to a dot. It collapses to a ring, a vibrating, rotating ring. And if you stick your hand through the ring, you wind up on the other side of forever. So the ring is the frame of the looking glass. So the simplest way to represent the wormhole is with a black hole, a spinning black hole, such that if you pass through the ring, you wind up on a parallel universe.
And so if you say A plus B equals B plus A, everybody knows exactly what you mean. It's a perfectly clear statement. But nobody needs to ask, what do you mean by A or what do you mean by B? Or if you say 1 plus 2 equals 3, that's perfectly clear. But you don't need to know 1 what, 2 what, or 3 what. And all our descriptions of the physical world have the nature of these formulae, numbers. They are simply mathematical patterns, because what we're talking about is pattern. But it's pattern of such a high degree of complexity that it's very difficult to deal with it by thinking. In science, we really work in two different ends of the spectrum of reality. We can deal with problems in which there are very few variables, or we can deal with problems in which there are almost infinitely many variables. But in between, we're pretty helpless. In other words, the average person cannot think through a problem involving more than 3 variables without a pencil in his hand. That's why, for example, it's difficult to learn complex music. Think of an organist who has 2 keyboards or 3 keyboards for work with his hands, and each hand is doing a different rhythm. And then his feet on the pedals, he can be doing a different rhythm with each foot. Now that's a difficult thing for people to learn to do, just like to rub your stomach in a circle and pat your head at the same time takes a little skill. Now, most problems with which we deal in everyday life involve far more than 3 variables. And we are really incapable of thinking about them. Actually, the way we think about most of our problems is simply going through the motions of thinking. We don't really think about them. We do most of our decision making by hunch. You can collect data about a decision that you have to make, but the data that you collect has the same sort of relation to the actual processes involved in this decision as a skeleton to a living body. It's just the bones. And there are all sorts of entirely unpredictable possibilities involved in every decision. And you don't really think about it at all. The truth of the matter is that we are as successful as we are, which is surprising, the degree to which we are successful in conducting our everyday practical lives, because our brains do the thinking for us in an entirely unconscious way. The brain is far more complex than any computer. The brain is, in fact, the most complex known object in the universe, because our neurologists don't understand it. They have a very primitive conception of the brain and admit it. And therefore, if we do not understand our own brains, that simply shows that our brains are a great deal more intelligent than we are. Meaning by we, the thing that we have identified ourselves with. Instead of being sensible and identifying ourselves with our brains, we identify ourselves with a very small operation of the brain, which is the faculty of conscious attention, which is a sort of radar that we have that scans the environment for unusual features. And we think we are that, and we are nothing of the kind. That's just a little trick we do. So actually, our brain is analyzing all sensory input all the time, analyzing all the things you don't notice, don't think about, don't have even names for. And so it is this marvelous complex goings-on which is responsible for our being able to adapt ourselves intelligently to the rest of the physical world. The brain is furthermore an operation of the physical world. But now you see, though, we get back to this question. Physical world. This is a concept. This is simply an idea. And if you want to ask me to differentiate between the physical and the spiritual, I will not put the spiritual in the same class as the abstract, but most people do. They think that 1 + 2 = 3 is a proposition of a more spiritual nature than, say, for example, a tomato. But I think a tomato is a lot more spiritual than 1 + 2 = 3.
The book. So it's so intriguing that a philosopher and a neuroscientist both have come to the conviction that this physicalistic, naturalistic view of the world which prevails in Western academic society is fundamentally flawed, fatally flawed, and will be done away with in the next generation. Wouldn't that be amazing if we were seeing or living at a time where naturalism and physical reductionism is actually on its last legs, despite it seeming to be the dominant paradigm in Western academia, that the next generation will see the unraveling of this naturalistic paradigm.
This is where we really get to the point. That's why in Zen Buddhism, when people ask what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism, you could very well answer a tomato. Because look how, when you examine the material world, how diaphanous it is. It really isn't very solid. A tomato doesn't last very long. Nor, for that matter, do the things that we consider most exemplary of physical reality, such as mountains. The poet says, "The hills are shadows, and they flow from form to form, and nothing stands." Because the physical world is diaphanous. It's like music. When you play music, it simply disappears. There's nothing left. And that, for that very reason, it is one of the highest and most spiritual of the arts, because it is the most transient. And so, in a way, you might say that transiency is a mark of spirituality. A lot of people think the opposite, that the spiritual things are the everlasting things. But you see, the more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless.
Real being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well. Why? Because this cause must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only two kinds of things that fit that description. Either abstract objects like numbers, or else an intelligent mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. It therefore follows that the cause of the universe is a transcendent personal mind.
Nothing is so dead as a diamond. And yet this imagery, the idea of the most mineral objects being the most permanent, and so they get associated with the spiritual. Jesus Christ is called the Rock of Ages. And even the Buddhists have used the diamond, the Vajra, as an image of the fundamental reality of the universe. But the reason why they used diamond was not that it was hard, but that it was completely transparent, and therefore afforded a symbol of the void, which everything fundamentally is. Not meaning that there simply is nothing there, but the void means that you cannot get any idea which will sufficiently define physical reality. Every idea will be wrong, and in that sense it will be void. So then, the physical world, we can't even find any stuff out of which it's made. We can only recognize each other, and I say, well, I realize that I met you before and that I see you again. But the thing that I recognize is not anything really except a consistent pattern. Let's suppose I have a rope, and this rope begins by being manila rope. Then it goes on by being cotton rope. Then it goes on with being nylon. Then it goes on with being silk. So I tie a knot in the rope, and I move the knot down along the rope. Now, is it as it moves along the same knot or a different knot? We would say it was the same, because you recognize the pattern of the knot. But at one point it's manila, at another point it's cotton, at another point it's nylon, and at another it's silk. And that's just like us. We are recognized by the fact that one day you face the same way as you did the day before, and people recognize your facing. So they say that's John Doe or Mary Smith. But actually the contents of your face, whatever they may be, the water, the carbons, the chemicals, are changing all the time. You're like a whirlpool in a stream. The stream is doing this consistent whirlpooling, and we always recognize, like at the Niagara, the whirlpool is one of the sights. But the water is always moving on. And we are just like that, and everything is like that. So there's nothing in the physical world that is what you might call substantial. It's pattern. And this is why it's so spiritual. To be non-spiritual is not to see that. In other words, it is to impose upon the physical world the idea of thingness, of substantiality. That is to be, in the sense that the Hindus use it, that is to be involved in matter, to identify with the body. To believe, in other words, that the body is something constant, something tangible. The body is really very intangible. You cannot pin it down. It's all falling apart furthermore. And we're aging.
And thus we're brought not merely to a supernatural cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
But going down to the basic principle which underlies the I Ching and which underlies the whole understanding of form, we have to realize that form and emptiness are inseparable poles of the same reality. We can go on from there to a lot of other implications that are vitally important to our feelings, to our emotional life, and to our sanity. But at least let's start with that. To get it into our intellects, the thing that is missing from our intellects, missing from our logic, is that the nothing principle is just as important as the something principle. That without the nothing, the something cannot be. We are afraid of it. We've been brought up to be afraid of it. In every conceivable way, we're told to be afraid of nothing. And of course, therefore, to be afraid of death. You'll be dead. You'll be nothing. And you can always be ruled by other people who are unscrupulous if you're afraid of death. As they say, well, we can obliterate you. And if you say, oh no, it mustn't come to an end, then they can rule you. Because they say, well, we have the power, we have the gun. Politics comes out of the barrel of a gun. It does not. Real politics comes out of nothingness. Because nothingness can always defeat the gun. And you can say, well, okay, I'll be nothing. Then see what happens. Because it always turns into something again. Nature abhors a vacuum. It keeps coming back. You can't get rid of it. Blow up the planet. Dissolve the whole thing. There are plenty of other planets. They'll keep coming back. Because nothing will always produce something. It's the logic of it.
Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give just one example, suppose you had an infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, and I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with self-contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer from 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world, such a convention has no sway. Obviously, you can give away whatever coins you want. Here's another example of the absurdity of an infinite past. Take the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Suppose that for every orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, the planet Jupiter completes 2. If Saturn has completed 10 orbits, Jupiter has completed 20. If Saturn has completed 1 trillion, Jupiter has completed 2 trillion. The longer they orbit, the farther Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter. But now, turn the story around. Suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Now, which one will have completed the most orbits? Well, the correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the greater the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical simply by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist.
Professor Craig also alludes to the mathematical reasons for thinking that the universe cannot be infinite in its past. The main mathematical reason for supposing that an infinite series of past events could not exist is something like the following. It's part of the concept of an infinite series of events that it didn't start, that it never started. So it follows that for any event in the series, that event had an infinite number of predecessor events. Now, that makes it extremely hard to see how we could have ever got to now. That makes it extremely hard to see how we could have ever got to the present moment. I mean, if the universe didn't start, if for every event in the series of past events, there is an infinite number of predecessor events, then how do we manage to get to this particular event? Now, considerations such as these do indeed render the notion of an infinite series of past events counterintuitive. Yeah? They do render the notion counterintuitive, but that something is counterintuitive doesn't entail that it's false. That something is counterintuitive doesn't entail that it couldn't exist. I mean, we used to think in philosophy that the way the world is had to conform to our intuitions, but the description of reality given by quantum mechanics shows that reality at its most fundamental level is radically counterintuitive. So to say that something is counterintuitive or absurd, or leads to counterintuitive or absurd consequences, I don't think carries much weight, and certainly isn't sufficient to establish the truth, certainly isn't sufficient to establish the impossibility of something.
Now, Dr. Kim also interacts with the philosophical argument for the finitude of the past. How can we get to today if there has to be an infinite number of prior events occur first? Notice he doesn't ever answer that question. He just says that sometimes our intuitions fail. Well, sure, sometimes, but it seems to me that it's quite reasonable to go with your intuitions unless and until you have some defeater for them, some reason to think that that's not the case, and we don't have that sort of a defeater.
What is not a component of Western common sense is that nothing is something. Now that may sound a little contradictory, but I think I can explain it. We treat nothingness as if it were ineffective, as if it wasn't really important at all. And yet, when we look out at the night and we see all these stars in space, try and imagine what the heavens would look like if there weren't any space. Then obviously there wouldn't be any stars. I mean, you could think that they would all be jammed together in a lump. There are various objections to that. How would you see the edge of the lump and know it was a lump without space around it? Furthermore, we know when we investigate the constitution of matter physically that at the atomic level there's more space in something than there is anything else. Most of it is empty, and which led a physicist at the Argonne lab at the University of Chicago, who had become a little nutty. He was so impressed with the emptiness of matter that he went around in the most enormous padded slippers in case he should fall through the floor.
Thank you very much, Peter. I should say that I have no prior or previous religious commitment whatsoever. I'm interested in philosophy. I'm interested in trying to solve philosophical problems. For decades I was some kind of materialist and reductivist in my thinking. Now, as a matter of fact, it's pretty much impossible, it turns out, to solve the really fundamental problems about the universe without recourse to theology, without recourse to the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the freedom of will. I don't particularly desire this conclusion, like most people in a way. Recently, or over the last so many decades, I was brought up to be suspicious of religious institutions and skeptical of religious beliefs. So I think that the answers to philosophical questions are theological. I think that the academic subject called philosophy exists through a lack of spiritual understanding or huge misconceptions about what spirituality is. Now, some of these misconceptions about religion and spirituality are shared by theists as well as atheists. Now, I'll just mention two misconceptions. One misconception is that the whole business is a matter of belief or disbelief. This is not right. It seems to me fundamentally a matter of knowledge. There's spiritual knowledge, and it's possible to have spiritual knowledge, and it's possible to lack spiritual knowledge, and the knowledge is of the nature of acquaintance or experience. It's not of centrally or paradigmatically of a propositional nature. Now, the other huge misconception is that if there is spiritual reality, or as the Dalai Lama puts it, ultimate reality, or if there is God, the other misconception is that God is a being, or in some way a thing, but not a physical thing, but an immaterial thing. Now, God is not being-like or thing-like. Now, I'll just very briefly mention three philosophical questions which show that we need to endorse a kind of theology or a kind of spirituality in order to do philosophy adequately or to stand any chance of answering the questions. Now, the first philosophical question is about time, the second philosophical question is about existence, and the third one is about you. Now, the hardest part, contrary to popular belief, the hardest part of doing philosophy is not answering the questions, it's understanding the questions. It's understanding the questions. There are very few people, even, I would say, teaching philosophy professionally in the West, who understand philosophical questions in their profundity. In fact, I'd say that philosophy is essentially stuck in the 18th century, and so sort of arguing for and against the existence of this being, and based on the view that metaphysics is impossible or can't be done. Stephen Hawking says that philosophy is dead. Well, if philosophy is dead, it committed suicide. Hume and Kant both committed suicide. But philosophy is not dead. It's just it's stalled. It's stalled 200 years ago. It's within a kind of, in this millennium, there are two huge pieces of human understanding which have yet to be digested by philosophy, which make a colossal difference. One of these is the philosophical implications of quantum physics, which my colleague Daniel Craig mentioned. And the other is Heidegger's thinking. The thinking of Martin Heidegger, which is yet to be fully digested and understood in European and North American philosophy departments. These two will bring about a revolution in philosophical understanding, but rather late in the day. Now, the three questions, just very briefly, are why is it now? What is it to be? And why is a human being you? Now, if you ask this question, why is it now? Simplistically or naively, the answer is, well, this is as far as the universe has got, whether it had a beginning or not. These events happening now have unrolled or are unrolling. This is as far as the universe has got. But this is a comparatively superficial answer for many reasons. Intuitively or centrally, this is a superficial answer because, in a sense, it's always now, or it's never not now. The future is always in the past. The future is always in the future, and the past is always in the past. Well, maybe the future is in the past as well, but we have to keep it simply. It's certainly true that any present is somebody else's future and somebody else's past. I mean, we're in some people's future and we're in some people's past, but never mind about that. Okay. The point is that there's a sense in which now is timeless. There's a sense in which it's always now, where this always doesn't really pick out duration or a moment or even something that's instantaneous, but something that's utterly changeless. Now, if you are sufficiently perceptive, you can notice that it's always now. I mean, members of the public who are not trained in philosophy are actually much better at spotting or having these insights than people who've been trained in philosophy faculties. The point is that presence is the presence of God. Presence is the presence of God. If we understand the unchanging nature of now, the nowness of now, if we understand that thoroughly, we'll realize that it has the attributes of God. It's immaterial, it's timeless, it's a necessary condition for everything that happens in time, and so on. Second question, what is being? There's a distinction between being and beings. I mean, by beings, I mean the Sheldonian theatre, your head, the Bodleian library, this ballpoint pen, examination scripts to mark and so on. These are beings or things that are. But by being, being as being, I don't mean another thing like that. I mean the existing that all this is doing, or what it is for any of this to be, or the being of what is, whatever is. Now, if you understand Heidegger, or if you don't like Heidegger, if you read Parmenides, you could start at the beginning of philosophy instead of at the end, if you like. If you understand Parmenides, you'll begin to understand that the properties of being, thoroughly understood, are the properties of God. Being is largely ineffable, necessary for beings, it's infinite, it's immaterial, and so on. And the third philosophical question is, why is something you? Now, this is again a hard question to understand because we think we already have the answer. We think the answer lies in biology, physics, chemistry, evolution, so on. Now, I don't want to deny any of those very well-known facts of science. Let's suppose they're all true, even though because science has a history, it's very unlikely that it can be true. Now, once all those facts are in about you, you were born in such and such a place, you've got such and such a mind, you have such and such a mother, such and such a father, and so on. We've not begun to understand why you view the world from this human being who you are. We've not begun to understand why all the human beings who are not you are, so to speak, arranged around you, but one of the human beings is inside out or outside in, and that's its being you. We haven't begun to understand that. It certainly has no materialist or scientific explanation. It's Peter's holding up a big sign saying stop. or it's quite a small sign, but it's got very big writing on it. Interesting comments.
He thinks that philosophy exists through a misconception of spirituality and that philosophy is stalled. And here I have to simply beg to disagree. I think that philosophy, and particularly from a Christian point of view, is an exercise in which Christians should be deeply engaged. I take it that Anselm was right in affirming fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. And philosophy is rightly a handmaid of theology, which can be very useful. And I would note that over the last 50 years in Anglo-American philosophy, there has been a veritable renaissance of Christian philosophy that is changing the face of this discipline. So that philosophy, far from being stalled, I think is being renewed. And I'm very enthusiastic about what is happening in that regard. One of the other, well, he asks, why is it now? Now, it seems to me that that question is trivial. That's like saying, why is it here? Why is it now? Now, it has to be now. That's a trivial question. The more interesting question is, why is it now? I think that is a philosophically significant question. And I've written an article on this, actually, and I think that the best mileage you can go toward answering that is that there was a beginning to time, that there was a beginning to the universe. Otherwise, it becomes inexplicable why, out of all the infinite moments of past time, it's now. Why this moment? Why 2011 is now? So I think this is one more reason to think the past is finite.
So the course of time is really very much like the course of a ship in the ocean. Because here's the ship, you see, and it leaves behind it a wake. And the wake fades out, and that tells us where the ship has been, in just the same way as the past and our memory of the past tells us what we have done. But as we go back into the past, and we go back and back to prehistory, and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened, we eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship. Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog.
But God is, by definition, a self-existent, timeless, necessary being. So if there is a God, yes, if there is a God, we'll talk about possibilities. If there is a God, there cannot be a cause of such an entity, any more than there can be a cause of the number 7 or the property of being blue. Things that begin to exist, that come into being, have causes, but something that's eternal and necessary.
So God was always there, and at some point along the line, although there was no time then, so clearly I can't say at some point in time, which
very
makes
good.
it,
that's right.
Which makes it mildly more difficult to pursue this, but nonetheless,
but that's right. Yeah.
At some point, God decided that he'd create this whole thing.
Rather, I would say not that he decided, but at some point he did create the whole thing.
Well, presumably, all right. He created the whole thing. Yeah.
Supposing there's a neurotic, difficult child, and one school of thought used to say, well, bang him about, beat him up, and maybe he'll change. But then they said, oh no, that's not fair to the child to beat him up because it was his parents. They didn't bring him up properly. And so then they say, well, punish the parents. Well, the parents say, excuse me, but our parents were neurotic too, and they brought us up badly, so we couldn't help what we did. And so since the grandparents are dead, we can't get at them. And in any case, supposing we could, we would pass the whole blame back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And they say they started all this mess. But then Eve would say, no, the serpent tempted me and I did eat, and it was the serpent's fault. Well, you know, when God, in the story of Genesis, asked Eve, didst thou eat the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat? She said, oh, but the serpent tempted me, and I did eat. And God looked at the serpent, And the serpent didn't make any excuse. He probably winked. Because the serpent, being an angel, was wise enough to know where the present begins. So you see, if you insist on being moved, being determined by the past, that's your game. But the fact of the matter is, it all starts right now. But we like to establish a connectivity with the past, because that gives other people the impression that we're sane.
You haven't got a better explanation of why the universe came. Well, you don't know. You said so.
Sorry, there's nothing to be ashamed about admitting ignorance. I don't understand the Big Bang. I vaguely, I discussed it with people. And if there are things that we don't understand, we just have to say we don't know. You don't have to invent mystical creatures in order to do it.
You don't have to invent mystical creatures.
Sorry? No.
You don't have to invent mystical creatures.
No, I don't think you do. I just think you have to say you don't know and keep on trying to find out, and maybe we'll never find out.
Yeah. And if you found it was a supernatural being?
Oh, I'd be absolutely shocked, but I would change my mind. But I'd need to think a tiny bit of evidence would be a very good beginning.
He's offered you evidence.
No, that's not evidence.
Certainly, there's more than a tiny bit of evidence on the table that the universe began to exist.
That's total speculation.
Well, the astronomer royal Martin Rees would beg to differ with you.
Well, he can beg if he wishes, and I like Martin very well.
In his book, Just Six Numbers, Martin Rees says,
the
evidence shows that the universe had a beginning, and then in these
I would agree all the evidence shows. Let's accept that fact. All the evidence suggests our universe had a beginning. But we don't know. That's what I keep telling you. Knowing and suspecting are two vastly different things.
I'm never saying that this is known with certainty. This is a mischaracterization on your part. Yes, well, and he says that the modern cosmology is as firmly established a science as the geology of the Earth. Yes. This is not a matter of airy-fairy speculation. That's a philosophically significant question. And I've written an article on this, actually, and I think that the best mileage you can go toward answering that is that there was a beginning to time, that there was a beginning to the universe. Otherwise, it becomes inexplicable why, out of all the infinite moments of past time, it's now. Why this moment? Why 2011 is now? So I think this is one more reason to think the past is finite.
If you ask me then, why am I talking? Well, I could say I'm making a living this way, or I have a message that I want to get across to you. But that is not the reason. I'm talking for the same reason that birds sing, and for the same reason that the stars shine. I dig it. Why do you dig it? Well, I could go on answering all sorts of questions about human motivation and psychology, but they wouldn't explain a thing, because explaining things by the past is really a refusal to explain them at all. All you're doing is postponing the explanation. You're putting it back and back and back and back, and that explains nothing.
Yes, well, and he says that the modern cosmology is as firmly established a science as the geology of the Earth. Yes. This is not a matter of airy-fairy speculation.
What does explain things is the present. Why do you do it now? Now, this is a slight cheat, because that doesn't explain it either. Because what happens now, just as the sound comes out of silence, all this comes out of nowhere. This is in connection with what I explained to you in another talk about the power of nothingness. All life suddenly emerges out of space. Bang, right now.
Now, it seems to me that that question is trivial. That's like saying, why is it here? Why is it now? Now, it has to be now. Now. That's a trivial question. The more interesting question is, why is it now? I think that is a philosophically significant question.
And to ask again, why does it happen, is an unprofitable question. Because the interesting thing is not why, but what. What happens? Not why does it happen.
I think that is a philosophically significant question.
Because the interesting thing is not why, but what.
what happens, not why does it happen. I can say, well, I am doing this now because I did that then, and so I am producing for you a continuous line of thought. But actually I'm doing it backwards. I'm doing it always from now and connecting up what I do now with what I did so that you can see a consistent story. If I define myself as the whole field of events, we'll say the organism-environment field, which is the real me, then all the things that happen to me may be called my doing. And that is the real sense of karma. But when we speak about freedom from karma, freedom from being the puppet of the past, that simply involves a change in your thinking. It involves, in other words, you're getting rid of the habit of thought whereby you define yourself as the result of what has gone before, and instead get into the more plausible and more reasonable habit of thought, in terms of which you don't define yourself in terms of what you've done before, but in terms of what you're doing now. And that is liberation from the ridiculous situation of being a dog wagged by its tail.
Yes.
Where the future and the past come together, it seems to me there isn't anything there. There is no now, really. It may seem very philosophical, but it seems like we don't exist. How could we exist? There's no now to exist. The past and the future come right together. Where is that place in between? How long is it?
There are two answers to that question. This is a real fun question. I love it. The question is about now. He's saying, really, there is no now. There is the future and the past come together. The future turns into the past, and it goes, and it's gone like that. So, in no time at all, the future has become past. And so we get this frantic feeling. Where did it go?
The point is that there's a sense in which now is timeless. There's a sense in which it's always now, where this always doesn't really pick out duration or a moment or even something that's instantaneous, but something that's utterly changeless.
Well, let's take the small view, first of all. The now is infinitely short, and yet it's the only thing that is.
The more interesting question is, why is it now? Otherwise, it becomes inexplicable why, out of all the infinite moments of past time, it's now.
In that case, this whole world is an illusion. It doesn't really exist. When the king, the Emperor Akbar, once was feeling a little sorry for himself and asked his jeweler, he said, make me a ring that will restrain me in prosperity and support me in adversity. And so the jeweler made him a ring and gave it to the emperor, and he saw written on it, "It will pass." Now the other side of the matter is this, that this short now is an illusion of the clock. We make our second marks on clocks as thin as is consistent with visibility. And therefore we always think of the present as crossing the hairline. Tick! That's too long, see? How short can you get? See? But really the present isn't like that at all. I mean, everything can go, right? There is nowhere else but now. Everything that happens is happening now.
Why is it now? Now it has to be now. Now. That's a trivial question.
Well, it's like your field of vision. Your field of vision isn't just a point of light. Your field of vision is an oval. And it isn't fuzzy at the edges. It just ceases to be at the edges. But there's plenty of room in it to see something move across. So in your field of time, your now, there is enough now to include a phrase of music. If there weren't, you wouldn't be able to make out melodies because there'd just be instantaneous notes with no connection between them. You would never hear intervals. So now is a big slobby thing. But it comes out of nothing. Yes, lady is standing by the pillar.
presence is the presence of God. Presence is the presence of God. If we understand the unchanging nature of now, the nowness of now, if we understand that thoroughly, we'll realize that it has the attributes of God. It's immaterial, it's timeless, it's a necessary condition for everything that happens in time, and so on.
He asks, what is being? And contrasts being with beings. But here I have to respectfully disagree and say, I do think that God is a being. God is a personal being who is the creator and designer of the universe and the locus of absolute goodness, whom we can know by acquaintance, as he said. But there's no reason to think that one compromises God's necessity or aseity by affirming that God is a literal being. Now, he's not, as one British journalist remarked, a chap. I think that's right. We shouldn't think of God as a sort of chap. But nevertheless, he is a necessary being who is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused, perfectly good, omnipotent, omniscient, and all of the rest of these superlative attributes. And finally, he asks, why is something you? And I would take this to be equivalent to the question, why do you exist? Why is something you is the same as saying, why do you exist? And I would find the answer to that question in God's providence and purpose. He has a plan for your life, and it's important as we go through life that we not miss that purpose for which God created us. Thank you.
What is more, we don't seem to have a problem with the notion of an infinite series of numbers. We don't have a problem with an infinite series of negative numbers, for example. So why should there be a problem with an infinite series of past events? Now, standardly, this sort of objection is dealt with by drawing a distinction between potential infinities and actual infinities. Right? So the series of negative numbers is a potential infinite, whereas an infinite series of past events is an actual infinite. But in any finite region of space, if we assume that space is real, then there will, it seems to me, be an infinite number of actual subregions within that area of space. There will be an infinite number of actual subregions, all of finite size. You can take a region of space that's, say, a meter long, and that region will be divisible into an infinite number of smaller subregions. Now, that's not a matter of a potential infinite. That seems to me to be a matter of an actual infinity of spatial regions. So if space is real, that actual infinity of regions is real. So I for one find it very hard to put my finger on any reason why there couldn't be an actual infinite series of events. There's no contradiction, it seems to me, involved in the notion of an infinite series of events. So I think, again, it's an open question as to whether or not the universe began to exist. Now
he says, but you can have an infinite series of negative numbers. How is that any different? Well, the critical difference between numbers and events in time is the tense of the events. As Dr. Priest emphasized, there's a property of nowness or presentness. There's temporal becoming, whereas numbers just exist tenselessly, timelessly, as it were. So there is no successive synthesis to get to a certain number by enumerating them first. In fact, what it would be more like would be someone who claims to have counted down all the negative numbers ending at 0 today, -3, -2, -1. Whew. And such a task, it seems to me, is absurd, because before any number could be counted, there would always be another number that would have had to have been counted first. So the problem lies in temporal becoming. He says, but don't we have examples of actual infinites in the spatial continuum? I would say no. There's no reason whatsoever to think that space is really continuous. It can be modeled as continuous mathematically, but there's no grounds for thinking that space really is continuous in the way described. I would agree with Aristotle that a line or a distance is logically prior to any subdivisions that we make on the line, so that this is merely an infinity in potentiality, not an actuality. To have, by contrast, an infinite past would be an infinite series of actual events of similar duration piling up without beginning, and then it really does occasion all sorts of interesting problems.
The whole idea of there being only space and nothing else at all is not only inconceivable but perfectly meaningless, because we always know what we mean by contrasts. We know what we mean by white in comparison with black. They must come into being together.
Because of the inseparability of these opposites, they always go together. This, as it were, hints at some kind of unity which underlies them.
You don't have first something and then nothing, or first nothing and then something.
This unity is called Tao.
Space and form, in that sense, go together as the fundamental things we're dealing with in this universe. That which is void is precisely form, and that which is form is precisely void. Now, it's amazing what doesn't exist in the real world.
By contrast, an infinite past would be an infinite series of actual events of similar duration piling up without beginning, and then it really does occasion all sorts of interesting problems.
In the real world, there aren't any things, nor are there any events. That doesn't mean to say that the real world is a perfectly featureless blank. It means that it is a marvelous system of wiggles. You cannot have the ups without the downs. Now, the same thing is true of all life together. We shouldn't really contrast existence with non-existence. The unconscious is, so to say, the part of experience which is doing consciousness, just as the trough manifests the wave, the space manifests the solid, the background manifests the figure. So it's interconnected. And so the many, many patterns of interconnections lock it all together into a unity, which is, however, much too complicated for us to think about, except in very, very simple, crude ways. But I am part of all this. The great energies. And so all that side of life which you call unconscious, unknown, impenetrable, is unconscious and is unknown and is impenetrable because it's really you.
Presence is the presence of God. Presence is the presence of God. If we understand the unchanging nature of now, the nowness of now, if we understand that thoroughly, we'll realize that it has the attributes of God. It's immaterial, it's timeless, it's a necessary condition for everything that happens in time, and so on.
So now what the point I'm making is this. If space is essential to solid, it's perfectly obvious then that nothing is essential to something. If you can't have something without nothing, it means nothing is pretty powerful stuff. Because something comes out of it. Like that. It's a dogma of Western thought expressed in the Latin phrase ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. But that's not so. Out of nothing comes something. Now you would say, well, if something comes out of nothing, there must be some kind of mystery inside nothing. It must have a secret structure of some kind. I mean, there must be sort of electrical goings-on. This is the trouble they have about cosmology. How could this world generate? Could it just be out of free-floating hydrogen? No, it's a much simpler idea than that. It comes out of real, solid nothing. It's so simple. Look, if you listen, you see, you live in a world where there's only sound for a moment. You'll hear every sound coming out of silence. Where do these sounds come from? Now they come out of silence. Suddenly, boing. And you can accustom yourself to seeing light doing the same thing. You can open your eyes and see all this world emerging out of nothing. Boing, like that. And fading off into the past. So that's what the future is unknown, because the future is zero. And everybody who tries to know it, and that's the whole endeavor of, you see, trying to be God. You don't need to try to be God. You are. But if you try to be God, it means you don't know you are. And therefore you try to know and dominate the future. And you believe prophets and things like that. Well, prophecy is simply contaminating the future with the past. Projecting what we know upon the unknown. And that's why really things like astrology, although interesting, are rather ridiculous. Because if you know the future, there's no surprise for you. A completely known future is past. You've had it.
This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe. But the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of any physical description of that moment. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state of the early universe, which some scientific popularizers have misleadingly and inaccurately referred to as nothing, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning.
So I'd like to say something first of all about the crux of Professor Craig's version of the cosmological argument, namely the second premise of the argument that the universe began to exist. Now, citing the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems, Professor Craig presents this second premise as an established scientific fact. Now, it's true that most cosmologists believe that our universe began to exist at the moment of the Big Bang. But physicists are also exploring the possibility that the universe was created from the death of an earlier universe. Instead of a Big Bang, the models indicate that our universe began from a kind of big bounce, with a predecessor universe contracting as it ended and then re-emerging as our new expanding universe. Now, if that theory proved correct, then it could mean that our universe did not have a finite beginning, but is instead part of a chain of universes that expand and then contract to give rise to a brand new universe. Now, this is very much a live possibility in contemporary cosmology, so I think it is a bit more of an open question than Professor Craig suggests, whether the universe did in fact have an absolute beginning in time.
Now, what about the premise that the universe began to exist? Here both Dr. Kame and Dr. Parrington object that there may be and are models of the universe in which there is a prior contracting phase to this present expansion. But the problem with those sorts of oscillating theories are at least twofold. First, thermodynamically, they face a very difficult problem, namely entropy is conserved from cycle to cycle. And that has the effect of generating a longer cycle time and a larger expansion radius with each cycle, so that as you trace the cycles back in time, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until you finally come to a beginning. So that such a model has an infinite future, but not an infinite past. Secondly, as the universe recontracts, it encounters quantum fluctuations. This is called BKL chaos, which would prevent the subsequent expanding phase. Here's what Alexander Vilenkin says about this. He says, you can avoid the theorem by postulating the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there is nothing wrong with having contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so it would never make it to the expanding phase. And that's exactly why infinitely precise fine-tuning is required on these oscillating models. So I don't think that these really do help to restore a plausibly tenable model of an infinite past. Even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse composed of many universes, their theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have an absolute beginning. Of course, highly speculative scenarios, such as loop quantum gravity models, string models, even closed time-like curves have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. Now, these models are all fraught with problems, but the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeed in restoring an eternal past. At most, they just push the beginning back a step. It says a theorem is only as good as its assumptions. The BGV theorem says that if the universe is on average expanding along a given world line, this world line cannot be extended or cannot be infinite to the past. A possible loophole is that there might be an epoch of contraction prior to the expansion. Models of this sort have been discussed by Arguementive and Grattan and by Carroll and Chen. Now the thing is, Lawrence, that in the very paper that I quoted from Alex Vilenkin last April, he shows specifically by name that the Arguementive and Grattan model and the Carroll and Chen model don't work.
No, he said you have to make an assumption about entropy. You have to make an assumption about the evolution of entropy at the point of minimum size. So you have to make an assumption, which he would argue that they don't have any rationale for. That's not the same as saying that they're wrong.
Well, yes it is. He argues that all of the evidence shows that the universe had a beginning, and that in these
I would agree
models,
all the evidence shows. Let's accept that fact. All the evidence suggests our universe had a beginning. But we don't know. That's what I keep telling you. Knowing and suspecting are two vastly different things.
I'm never saying that this is known with certainty. This is a mischaracterization on your part. What I argue is that the premise is more probably true than false. And actually, you agree with me on that the universe began to exist. But I want to
say it's likely that the universe began
on
to
this
exist.
claim that I've somehow misrepresented Vilenkin.
Well, but the key line is the last one. That the theorem breaks down to the point when it really matters.
One at a time.
There's more here, because I noticed that at the end of this paragraph, where the Carroll, Chen, and Arguementive-Grattan models are mentioned, that he specifically shows...
Because it was technical. He talked about the fact that you
Lawrence, hang on a second, just let the...
He specifically shows that these models cannot be past eternal, and that they involve, therefore, a beginning of the universe,
Bill,
just like the others.
You can do the math if you want.
I'd
love you to do it.
Now wait. I couldn't help notice, although it's down from the screen now, that there was a series of ellipsis points following the paragraph.
Yeah, because it was technical, and I thought
it
was,
I wonder what you've deleted from the original letter.
No, wait.
I
just told you.
No, wait. Yeah, but you didn't.
I just told you. He says that you assume a minimum of entropy at the lowest point, for which there's no rationalization in the papers and within the context of the model given, and therefore he finds them unpleasant.
Could it have been something like this? You can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there's nothing wrong with having a contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so that it would never make it to the expanding phase.
There's a growth. In this paper, that's absolutely right. There are many assumptions about entropy and uniformity that make those models look artificial. But it's not. But that's different than saying they're wrong, especially if the minimum occurs at a point where quantum effects are important and the whole classical theory goes out the window. That's the key point. Quantum mechanics. We don't have a theory of quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is required to understand the universe at t equals 0. Until we do, it's unknown.
Isn't it true that the only viable quantum gravity models on order today involve a beginning, have a finite past?
No.
Well, can you give us one then?
Well, it depends what you mean. There are viable models of a multiverse in which the multiverse is eternal. There are conformally, in fact, I noticed you were maybe, at one point you quoted, no, you didn't now, but I was prepared to jump on you in case you did. Roger Penrose.
Right.
And there's classically conformal theories that in fact involve a cyclical universe, and they're perfectly consistent at this point, but none of them, the point is all of them have flaws because none of them are a true quantum theory of gravity. So all of them are open to question. In my experience in science, all of them are probably wrong. Because if you know, most theories are wrong, which is why it's hard.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so I always bet, in fact, I bet the Higgs wouldn't exist, because most simple theories are wrong.
You bet against it.
Yeah, because it just seemed too simple and slimy. But on the other hand, the difference is, while I thought it was ugly, it exists, so I've changed my mind. And in fact, I wrote a paper that showed that fine-tuning that you talk about is natural in the context of the models once you add a Higgs. So I actually explained the fine-tuning just last week.
But then the inevitable question arises, why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? Some intrepid atheists have asserted that the universe just popped into being without a cause. But surely that's metaphysically impossible. For such a conclusion is, in the words of philosopher of science Baron of Königseider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes.
I admire the clarity of argument, the pure intelligence, the honesty and the rigor with which the philosophy has been done this evening. But if we really did have spiritual lives, we wouldn't need to be arguing for and against the existence of God. If we lived in the presence of God, if we knew beyond the shadow of doubt through direct acquaintance that God is all around us and pervades us, and in a fundamental way, there's nothing but God and creation, we wouldn't need to engage in philosophical arguments for and against the existence of a being. That's what I mean by spirituality making philosophy redundant.
So then, let me connect this with the problem of birth and death, which puzzles people enormously, of course. Because in order to understand what the self is, you have to remember that it doesn't need to remember anything. Just like you don't need to know how you work your thyroid gland. So then, when you die, you're not going to have to put up with everlasting non-existence, because that's not an experience. A lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. And sort of undergo that. But one of the most interesting things in the world, this is a yoga, this is a way of realization. Try and imagine what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Think about that. Children think about it. It's one of the great wonders of life. What will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And if you think long enough about that, something will happen to you. You will find out, among other things, that it'll pose the next question to you. What was it like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? That was when you were born. You see, you can't have an experience of nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. So after you're dead, the only thing that can happen is the same experience, or the same sort of experience as when you were born. In other words, we all know very well that after people die, other people are born. And they're all you. Only you can only experience it one at a time. Everybody is I. You all know you are you. And wheresoever beings exist throughout all galaxies, it doesn't make any difference. You are all of them. And when they come into being, that's you coming into being. You know that very well. Only you don't have to remember the past. In the same way, you don't have to think about how you work your thyroid gland. or whatever else it is in your organism. You don't have to know how to shine the sun. You just do it. Like you breathe. Doesn't it really astonish you that you are this fantastically complex thing? And that you're doing all of this and you never had any education in how to do it? You never learned, but you're this miracle? Well, the point is that from a strictly physical, scientific standpoint, this organism is a continuous energy with everything else that's going on. And if I am my foot, I am the sun. Only we've got this little partial view. We've got the idea that no, I'm just something in this body, the ego.